So I thought maybe I would speak first and then we would do some meditation, but I changed my mind. So how about if we do some meditation first? If you just sit comfortably, you can close your eyes or not. And see if you can settle your attention on just the normal, natural breath. The breath as it's appearing, as it's changing, wherever you feel it most distinctly. At the nostrils, at the chest, or at the abdomen. Bring your attention to that place and rest. See if you can feel one breath without concern for what's already gone by, without leaning forward for even the very next breath, just this one. And if you find your attention has wandered to the past, to the future, judgment, speculation, whatever, feel the incredible nature of that moment when we can let go. Without judgment, without harshness, without belittling ourselves, just relinquishing the hold on that distraction. And we can experience the incredible power of being able to begin again. No matter what. We can let go and begin again. And just bring your attention back to the feeling of the breath. Just as an experiment, why don't you bring to mind some time when you were really hurt or upset, pressured, impatient, and fill your being with that sense of that time. See what happens to your breath. In a similar way, bring to mind some time when you felt really opened, inspired, loving, understood, clear. Fill your being with that memory and see what happens to the feeling of your breath. And then go back to just the natural breath here and now, however it's appearing. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes. It's a good way to spend a few minutes, isn't it? So I have been teaching meditation since 1974. I went to India in 1970. I was actually a college student. I went, like David, sort of my junior year abroad, but a lot earlier than he did. And ended up staying, like many people actually, from my college, a little longer than a year. And I finally came back from India in 1974 as a teacher. One of my own teachers had asked me to teach. So just as Barry was describing, those were the days when, especially if you said you were teaching meditation, people were flabbergasted. They just didn't know what to say in response. And the most kind of funny thing I would hear was, did you meet the Beatles when you were over there? And they'd say, well, no. And the rest of it was just like, what? So, of course, I'm amazed, at this moment in time and where we are and who we are and everything that's happening. It's quite surreal to me, actually. And it's also very heartwarming. It's very beautiful. In terms of the whole landscape of meditation practices, I spent many years of my life especially teaching loving kindness and compassion practices as well as mindfulness. And I spent many of those years really, I think, trying to bolster the idea that kindness, loving kindness, compassion, good-heartedness were not weaknesses, were not passive. They were not going to make you into some kind of doormat, that these were strengths, these were forces. I felt like in the culture, and I think it's pretty clear that even the idea of love can be sort of degraded so that people think you become sort of weak and maybe a little silly through kindness, that it really is a sort of secondary virtue, that if you can't be brilliant and you can't be wonderful and you can't be courageous, it was like, okay, be kind. It's like, it's something. It's like, not great, but, it's nice, right? And so that was so much my emphasis was like, hey, let's look at this. This is a power. This is something that is transformative. It's revolutionary. This doesn't make us weak and simpering and giving in. And then a couple of years ago, I wrote a book, and the publisher gave it the title, Real Happiness. So then I found myself on the happiness train. And all of a sudden I was talking about happiness, and I found in many ways, even though the introduction so nicely said we all want real happiness, I found a lot of resistance. It was very interesting that so many people responded to the word happiness as though, well, that's silly. That's just kind of frivolous, that's shallow, that's pleasure-seeking, that's selfish. Why would you want that? There's much more important things to be achieving, to be accomplishing. In fact, the very first interview I had after the book came out, which was with somebody that was an awful lot like Dan Harris, the first question he asked was something like, just to be provocative, he said something like, are you trying to tell me that the kind of happiness I feel when I'm having a lovely dinner with my wife isn't real? And I thought, there it is. And I said, as I believe, no, of course I think it's real. And if anything, we should be more grateful. We should pay more attention and not be so distracted during that dinner. We should feel the tremendous gift of that dinner. But then I said, well, what about the night you don't like your dinner all that much? And I thought, but I didn't say, what about the night you don't like your wife all that much? Because they happen, right? So when we say real happiness, we're not talking about something that is so breakable and cannot be sustained or renewed in adversity. So I sort of went on tour with that book, and a lot of the questions were about that. Haven't you ever seen the bumper sticker that says, if you're not depressed, you're not paying attention? Like city after city after city. And I'd say, well, yeah, I understand that, because we can be so conflict avoidant. We can be so resistant and ashamed and afraid of looking at pain, our own or someone else's. But how do we carry on? Where do we have that sense of not just sufficiency, but flourishing? Where does generosity come from, where it's natural? It's not something we're trying to follow some guidelines or a system of belief, but it's like this flow. It's coming from some reservoir of something. And where does that quality of paying attention to someone come from when there's no immediate exchange involved, when we don't know what we're getting back? Because it's also like a flow. There's some wellspring within us that when we feel broken, when we feel depressed, when we feel exhausted, when we feel overcome, when we feel just shattered, we don't have the wherewithal, do we, to be in that kind of responsive, caring, giving state. And so happiness, in the sense of real happiness, isn't just getting what we want, which is a fantastic thing, but it's something much deeper that is renewable, that isn't so based on circumstance, that is something that we can grow and nurture and return to, just like we return to the breath just now. So there I was on the happiness train, and the publisher of that book suggested I write kind of like a sequel, which is Real Happiness at Work. So I have been teaching meditation since 1974. I have an organization, the Insight Meditation Society, so I know a little bit about organizational life. I've written, I don't know how many books, several books. But my work life has all been quite countercultural, you could say. So I realized I had a huge amount to learn, and I went about trying to learn it. So I talked to all kinds of people, from tech startup people to hedge fund managers to longshoremen, lots of nurses, special ed teachers, lots of firefighters and police officers, all of whom were using meditation in their work life. And I heard, of course, lots of stories about real unhappiness at work. And I heard tremendous stories of people who had found meaning, who had a sense of resilience, who were practicing mindfulness, who were practicing compassion as active trainings. I heard stories about people facing tremendous ethical dilemmas, like the range from minor annoyances or cloudy questions, not quite knowing what to do, to really feeling kind of a soul wound and an inability to continue betraying their own values in some particular context, and felt like they had to leave. I heard stories of incredible creativity and people breaking through the bounds of the narrow definition of what their job was supposed to be, and had a tremendous amount of fun in the process of getting bigger and going beyond. And so it was really out of this tremendous, rich learning that I was able to create this process, or this book, to be able to in some way honor the gifts everyone had given me in describing their lives. And so it is really those pillars that we talk about. We talk about mindfulness training, of course, and you all know clearly, both from experience and practice, as well as learning what that basically means. I would add, also going back to the first panel this morning, that the nature of mindfulness classically is not just to have a healed life, which of course it will help us do. It's a much better cup of tea when we feel the warmth of the teacup and we smell the tea and we taste the tea. It's really a lot better. And that's a very important thing. But the main function of mindfulness classically is a platform for insight. It's for wisdom. When we're struggling against our experience and we can't stand it, and we're just pushing against it all of the time, then there's not a whole lot of learning that's going to go on. And at the same time, when we're subsumed, we're over-identified, we are lost with no space, no spaciousness at all in some experience, there's not going to be a whole lot of learning that goes on. And so just having that relationship of interest, looking, some space, is what allows us to have very deep insight, and that really is the hallmark of mindfulness. We understand the nature of things. If we're in this really complex situation at work and bad communication with somebody, we can take a look at our own motive. We can understand what we want out of a conversation. Do we want to hurt somebody? Do we want to help? Do we actually want to resolve this situation? Or maybe we want to triumph and just put this other person down. We can take a look and understand our conditioning. One of the things that has become so clear to me, and was especially clear maybe in researching this book, was how I really feel like we live in a culture of disparagement, and that we're taught in so many ways that we will feel so much better about ourselves, maybe especially at work, by putting other people down, and that we will just have this sense of singularity, which is completely unreal. And so to actually feel joy in the accomplishments of others is not an easy thing, is it? But that's a practice. Sometimes we have that kind of resentment or envy because it feels to us like happiness or the good things in life are a limited commodity, and the more someone else has, the less there's going to be for us. And so we freak out. We feel frightened. Oh, no, you got that. And it may not be when we're in direct competition either. Sometimes, of course, we are, but a lot of times we're not, but we feel as though we are. And so we have a chance to look at our motivation and everything that's guiding us. What do we really believe? I was thinking the other day about this phrase, it's a dog-eat-dog world. It's quite a phrase, isn't it? And dogs don't eat dogs, right? But it's so gruesome. And what does that feel like? What does it mean? And how prevalent is that sense? You got it, I lost it. We're always in that kind of win-lose mentality. So what's the revolution in consciousness that's possible? It means alignment, which is another word that's come up this morning, which is so fantastic. Again, if you go back to the original Buddhist texts and the translations from them, it's very interesting. The word, especially since the first panel today was on suffering, at some part of it, the word that we translate as suffering really means misalignment. It's the sense of course, they use some example like a chariot where the axle is like rubbing. It's not quite working. The motion is really jerky. It's not smooth because there's misalignment. And things aren't fitting together into this whole. And so that sense we carry. Sometimes the suffering is intense, it's powerful, we're in a state of loss of something, or there's real conflict in our lives. Sometimes it's just this feeling of poignancy. I tried to make a difference. Didn't happen on my timetable. Couldn't quite master that situation. I couldn't make it work. There's so many ways in which we feel this kind of dissatisfaction, this dis-ease, and it's not wrong to feel by any means. I mean, how can we not feel it? But it can be held in a much bigger context of understanding that this is the nature of things, that something doesn't always work on our timetable, that some parts of life are outside of our control, and no matter what, we live in an interconnected universe where our lives all have something to do with one another. And so rather than falling into that notion of it's a dog-eat-dog world and I'm going to make it alone or not at all, or your success is going to bring me down, or all of those other carryovers from our conditioning, we can have a very different sense of the truth. And so aligning with the truth of how things are is the goal of our meditation practice, and that's what brings happiness. It's just being able to connect to the truth of how things are, which will open us to this much bigger picture of reality. And one of the things I'm so intrigued about in the time we live in is that it doesn't take a spiritual understanding to have this sense of interconnectedness connection. Everything is pointing to it. Economics shows us this, and environmental understanding shows us this, and even epidemiology shows us this, where, that notion that what happens over there is just nicely going to stay over there and not ripple out and affect us over here. And what happens over here, what we do, it doesn't matter. It does matter, right? Because we live in this interconnected universe. I don't know how many of you might have seen the movie Contagion. Did you see it? Well, my friend Larry Brilliant, who many of you might know, who'd been a doctor in the anti-smallpox campaign in India, was a technical advisor on the movie. And so he brought me to the opening in New York City, and it was like, basically the theme of the movie is like day 1 in Hong Kong, someone has a really bad day. Day 4, half the earth is wiped out. And they modeled it, so this wasn't just like total fantasy. And it was the kind of movie-going experience where, like, if somebody sneezed and everyone else in the theater was like, oh my God, like, what do you have? So this recognition that we're interconnected isn't always delightful and wonderful, but it's always true. And so everything that we do toward real happiness, toward authentic happiness, toward something that will abide, something that will help sustain us through changing circumstance, has to do with that truth of connecting to how things are and letting that actually sustain us in our work as well as everywhere else. So thank you.